What happens to a man who has everything and still cannot save himself from himself? Marcus Aurelius governed the greatest empire the Western world had ever known. He had absolute power over millions of lives. He had wealth beyond any measure. He had the respect of generals, senators, and philosophers. He had a name that history would preserve for more than 2,000 years with an almost religious reverence. And every night, after the audiences, after the battles, after the decisions that moved the fate of entire nations, he sat alone and wrote to himself about how much he still needed to improve. Not to be published, not to be read by anyone, not to build a legacy or impress posterity. For himself, for the man who existed beneath the emperor, the real human being, with anger, with exhaustion, with doubt, with the constant temptation to act in ways that contradicted everything he believed was right. This is what makes Marcus Aurelius different from any other leader that history has recorded. Not what he built, not the wars he won, not the territory he governed, but the fact that at the absolute peak of human power, he still saw himself as a work in progress, still held himself accountable, still questioned himself, still treated self-knowledge not as a destination reached, but as a daily practice that never ends. The Meditations, the diary he never planned for you to read, are the most honest record that exists of how an extraordinary mind deals with the most ordinary challenges of the human condition. The anger you feel when someone disappoints you, the exhaustion that wants to give up when effort produces no result, the temptation to act from ego when the situation calls for humility, the difficulty of getting out of bed on a day when the world feels too heavy. Marcus Aurelius wrote about all of this with an honesty that no emperor would have had the courage to show publicly, with a clarity that 2,000 years of distance have not managed to make obsolete. Because the problem was never the era, the problem is the human condition, and the human condition has no expiration date. But here is what most people don't know: the detail that completely changes how you read every word he wrote. Marcus Aurelius was not a philosopher who became emperor by accident of fate and who spent his days in tranquil contemplation. He was a man in permanent war. War on the empire's borders against invasions that never stopped. War inside the palace, against betrayals that came from where he least expected. War against diseases that decimated his army and his family. War against a body that was progressively failing while he still needed to lead. And in the middle of all that, at the exact center of the chaos, he chose every night to sit and examine not the world around him, but himself. Not what others were doing wrong, but what he still needed to correct in himself. That level of internal discipline, that absolute refusal to let external circumstances determine who you are on the inside, is what the Meditations teach. Not as theory, as lived practice, tested under the most extreme conditions a human being can face. And what he discovered about the most dangerous enemy any leader faces will change the way you see every challenge in your own life. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you've made it this far, if something in these first words resonated with something real inside you, with that feeling of a gap between who you are and who you decided to be, between what you know you should do and what you actually do when no one is watching, that already says a lot about you. Most people never stop to ask this kind of question. You stopped. So it makes sense that you be part of this for real. Hit the like button now. Not for the number, but because that gesture says this kind of content matters. That real philosophy applied to real challenges has value. That you want more conversations like this. And every like makes this video reach more people who are stuck exactly between who they are and who they want to be, and who need to hear what Marcus Aurelius discovered. In the comments, I want to ask you a direct question. Have you ever held yourself accountable for something you did or failed to do, even when no one saw it. Have you ever felt the weight of not being in a particular moment the person you decided to be? Write it below. A word, a sentence, an entire story. This space is yours, because the most important conversations on this channel don't happen in the video, they happen in the comments. And what you write might be exactly what someone going through the same thing needed to read today. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and activate the bell, not out of habit, but because what is being built in this series goes far beyond a single video. It is a line of thought that begins with Socrates, passes through Aristotle, through Marcus, Aurelius, and that will continue with the names and ideas that most radically changed how human beings understand themselves and each other. You won't want to lose the thread. Now let's enter the story of the most powerful man in the world, and the diary he never planned for anyone to read. There is a detail about Marcus Aurelius's meditations that almost no one mentions, and that completely changes how you read every word he wrote. He had no intention of publishing them. There was no editorial plan, no final revision, no narrative structure designed for an external reader. What reached us are private notes, written in Greek, not Latin, the official language of the empire he governed, as if he needed an extra layer of privacy, a language that most people around him didn't use in daily life. A man who ruled the world writing to himself in a language that was, in part, a hiding place. Think about what that means. The most powerful emperor in the known world, with unrestricted access to scribes, to historians, to all the resources necessary to build whatever legacy he desired, chose to write for no one, chose the honesty of anonymity over the performance of posterity, chose to hold himself accountable in silence rather than celebrate himself in public. And it was exactly that choice that made the Meditations the most extraordinary document that Western philosophy has produced, not for its intellectual depth, though that is there on every page, but for the brutal honesty of a man who knew no one was watching and chose to examine himself anyway, perhaps especially because of that, because it is easy to be who you want to be when you have an audience. It is easy to demonstrate virtue when there is someone to witness it. True self-knowledge, the kind Socrates pursued in the streets of Athens and Marcus Aurelius practiced in the silence of his room, begins exactly where the audience ends. In the moment when you are alone with your own thoughts, and must decide who you are without any social mirror to confirm the version you prefer to believe. Marcus Aurelius wrote in that space. And what he wrote in those moments was not grand, not what you'd expect from an emperor. It was human in a way that shocks through its closeness. In one entry, he writes about the difficulty of getting out of bed in the morning, about the temptation to stay under the covers and let the day begin without him. Not poetically, directly, almost irritated with himself. A man who had armies at his disposal, who decided the fate of nations with a word, writing about the difficulty of starting the day, about the same weight you may have felt this week. In another entry, he writes about people who irritate him, not in abstract terms, not as a distant philosophical exercise, but with a specificity that reveals there were concrete people in his life who tested his patience in very real ways. And then, immediately, he holds himself accountable for letting that happen, for giving another person the power to disturb his internal state, for confusing the other's behavior, which is outside his control, with a problem that needs to be solved internally. This is what makes the Meditations different from any other philosophical text that exists. It is not a treatise. It is not a system of thought presented with a beginning, middle, and end. It is a conversation of a man with himself, conducted in real time, in the middle of life, not in retrospect. It is the record of someone trying, failing, correcting himself, trying again, without the comfortable distance of later reflection. without the artificial clarity that time gives to memories, with all the confusion and contradiction and real exhaustion of a life being lived while it is being examined. And here is what this has to do with you. You probably have a version of yourself that you present to the world, a calibrated version, not necessarily dishonest, but selected. The version that works. Well, in social situations, that meets the expectations of people important to you, that sustains the narrative you've built about who you are. This version exists in all of us. It isn't weakness. It's part of how human beings function in society. But there is another version, the one that appears at 3 in the morning when the silence is too large to ignore, the one that emerges in moments of real pressure, when you're too tired to maintain the performance, the one that acts in ways that contradict who you say you are, and that leaves you with that specific feeling of internal discomfort that has no exact name, but that everyone recognizes when they feel it. Marcus Aurelius knew that version very well, and instead of ignoring it, instead of covering it with the grandeur of the office he held, instead of using the absolute power he had as anesthesia to avoid facing what was underneath, he wrote about it every night, with an honesty that didn't ask permission and didn't wait for approval. That was the exercise, not meditation in the modern sense, not breathing, not relaxation, not disconnection from the world, but the opposite, a forced and deliberate connection with what is real, a refusal to be deceived by the comfortable narrative, a practice of seeing without veils, oneself first, before anything else. And this was not easy for him. This is perhaps the most important and least celebrated part of the Meditations. They reveal that Marcus Aurelius struggled, that the Stoic principles he defended were not natural to him. They were conquered, written and rewritten because they needed to be remembered repeatedly, because human nature pushed constantly in the opposite direction. Think about what that means for you, for me, for anyone who has ever held themselves accountable for not consistently being who they want to be. The man considered the supreme example of philosophical virtue in Western history needed to remind himself every day not to act from anger, needed to write to himself about the importance of treating people with kindness, because without that reminder, exhaustion and frustration threatened to take over. Needed to revisit repeatedly the idea that death is inevitable, because without that thought, the ego started making decisions the man wouldn't approve of. He had not arrived. He was arriving, always arriving, never arrived. And perhaps that is exactly what makes the Meditations not just philosophically relevant, but personally urgent. For anyone who takes seriously the question of who they are becoming, not the finished portrait of a perfect sage, but the living, messy, and honest process of a human being trying day after day to be a little more than they were yesterday. But to understand the real weight of what Marcus Aurelius was carrying when he wrote these words, to understand why self-knowledge was for him not a philosophical luxury, but a survival necessity, you need to understand who he was before the diary, before the battles, before the office that no one asks for and that destiny places on your shoulders anyway. You need to understand what history rarely tells about him, not the emperor who entered the books, but the man who existed beneath all of that, with fears, with losses, with choices that cost more than any recorded battle in the annals of Rome. If you've ever felt the distance between who you are and who you decided to be, if you've ever held yourself accountable in silence for something no one saw, write in the comments, "I am still arriving." Because that phrase, simple as it is, describes exactly what Marcus Aurelius practiced every night, and what separates those who grow from those who merely age. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 AD into a Roman elite family, not the imperial family, but close enough for destiny to reach him. His father died when he was 3 years old. That detail rarely appears in popular biographies. It rarely occupies more than a line in the books that celebrate the philosopher-emperor. But it matters in a way that goes far beyond historical chronology, because the early absence of a father, especially in a culture like Rome's, where the paternal figure was the gravitational center of a man's entire moral and social formation, leaves a specific kind of gap, not just emotional, structural, the gap between who you would have become with that presence versus who you must build yourself without it. Marcus Aurelius was raised by his paternal grandfather, and in the opening pages of the Meditations, the pages most people skip because they seem like merely a formal list of acknowledgements, he does something extraordinary. He documents with precision and genuine gratitude what each important person in his life taught him, not as protocol, as a conscious inventory of formation, as a man who understands that who he is results directly from who formed him, and who wants clarity about that. From his grandfather, kindness and self-control. From his father, whom he barely knew, the image of modesty and masculinity without arrogance, an image built from accounts, not direct memory, which is perhaps even more revealing. From his mother, piety, generosity, simplicity of life despite wealth. From each tutor, each teacher, each figure that crossed his formation, he extracts a specific lesson named, recognized. This is not a courtesy list. It is an act of deep self-knowledge. It is a man saying, I know where I came from. I know what formed me. And because I know, I can consciously choose what I want to carry and what I want to leave behind. Think about how many people do this. Think about how many people stop, genuinely, honestly, without hurry, to examine who formed them and what each person planted in them. Not just the positive influences that are comfortable to recognize, but everything. The limiting beliefs inherited without noticing, the behavioral patterns absorbed by osmosis, the ways of reacting to fear, anger, disappointment that were not chosen. They were copied from someone at some point before you had enough consciousness to choose differently. Marcus Aurelius did that inventory deliberately, and did it before anything else in the Meditations, as if he knew that all real self-knowledge begins there, not in abstract theories about human nature, but in concrete and uncomfortable questions about your own specific nature, about how you were made, about who planted what in you, and whether you still want it to grow. But there was something in Marcus Aurelius's formation that wasn't in the books or in the tutors, something that destiny brought when he was 17 years old and that changed the trajectory of everything that would follow. Emperor Hadrian, without direct heirs, watching young Marcus with an attention that went beyond protocol, began moving the pieces of the imperial chessboard. The story that followed is complex, full of political adoptions and premature deaths. But the result was this. Marcus Aurelius was adopted by Antoninus Pius, who had in turn been adopted by Hadrian with the explicit condition that Marcus would be the next emperor of Rome. He was 17 years old when he learned that one day he would rule the world, and his first reaction, documented by historians of the time, was not euphoria, not satisfied ambition. It was reluctance, a quiet sadness for what was being lost, private life, the freedom to study philosophy without the weight of power, the possibility of being an ordinary man in an era when being ordinary meant being free. Think about that for a moment. Most people spend their entire lives pursuing power, recognition, influence, building strategies to reach higher, to be seen, to occupy larger spaces. And here was a 17-year-old to whom the greatest power in the Western world was handed. And what he felt was loss. That reaction says everything about who Marcus Aurelius was before he became who history recorded. It says that power was never what he wanted, that the emperor who would become the most admired in Roman history did not desire to be emperor, That every decision he made, every battle he led, every night he spent examining himself in the diary was made by a man who would have preferred, at some fundamental level, to be somewhere else. And perhaps that is exactly what made him so extraordinary in the role. Because power in the hands of those who desire it above all things tends to corrupt with a speed and completeness that history confirms repeatedly. But power in the hands of one who did not want it, who received it as responsibility rather than reward, as burden rather than trophy, that power has a different quality, a different relationship with the ego, a different resistance to the temptation that power inevitably offers. Marcus Aurelius spent 20 years as co-heir before becoming emperor. 20 years observing, learning, being formed for a role he had not asked for but had accepted with a seriousness that few can sustain for so long. During those 20 years, while other young men of the Roman elite used wealth and position to build pleasure and reputation, he studied Stoic philosophy with a dedication his contemporaries considered almost excessive, not because he was obligated, because he had found something that made sense in a way nothing else did. Something that answered the question destiny had placed on his shoulders since the age of 17. How do you live well with a weight you didn't choose? Stoicism didn't promise to remove the weight. It promised to teach how to carry it without being destroyed by it. It promised clarity about what was within your control and what was not, and the discipline to invest energy only in the first group, wasting nothing on the second. For a man who would soon have to make decisions affecting millions of lives, who would have to lead armies in wars he didn't want, who would have to manage betrayals from people he should have been able to trust, that distinction was not academic philosophy. It was the difference between surviving the role and being destroyed by it. And when the moment came, when Antoninus Pius died in 161 AD and Marcus Aurelius officially became Emperor of Rome, what he did in the first hours of absolute power reveals something that no biographer can fully explain without drawing on the character the Meditations expose. He insisted on sharing power. There was another heir, Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, who technically had rights to the throne. Marcus Aurelius not only recognized those rights, he equalized them with his own. In a gesture without precedent in Roman imperial history, he divided power with Lucius Verus and governed as co-emperor, not because he was obligated, not because there was political pressure to do so, but because he considered it the right thing to do. A man who had just received absolute power voluntarily chose to divide that power. Lucius Verus was the opposite of Marcus in almost everything: indulgent, hedonistic, more interested in gladiators and parties than in philosophy and responsibility. The partnership was not natural, not easy, and everyone around Marcus knew this. But he maintained it, with genuine loyalty, not performative, with the conviction that his obligations did not depend on the other's behavior to remain valid. This is one of the first great lessons the Meditations teach in practice. Before any philosophical concept is explained, before any theory is presented, the lesson that integrity is not something you display when conditions are favorable. It is something you maintain, especially when conditions make abandonment easier and more understandable than staying. But Marcus Aurelius's integrity would be tested in far more severe ways than the partnership with Lucius Verus. Because just months after assuming power, the empire began presenting its bill, and the bill was higher than any man could have anticipated. There is an entry in the Meditations that Marcus Aurelius probably wrote on a winter night somewhere on the Danube frontier, with the army camped around him and cold seeping through the cracks of the command tent. It says, in essence, get up. You have work to do, not with grandeur, not with motivational speech, with the clinical coldness of a man telling himself what he needs to hear to function the next day, like an order issued from one part of himself to another. from the part that understands to the part that wants to yield. That entry exists because Marcus Aurelius was exhausted. Not the physical tiredness of battle, though that was also there, but the other exhaustion, the deepest kind, the one that doesn't pass with sleep. The exhaustion of carrying a weight that has no end in sight, of making decisions that affect millions without the guarantee they are the right ones, of being the fixed point around which everything revolves while inside you also feel yourself spinning, also losing your axis, also needing something solid to hold. That exhaustion is universal. You don't need to be an emperor to know it. You know it when the work doesn't stop and the body asks for rest the schedule doesn't allow. When the people around you depend on a version of you that is at the limit of being able to show up. When you look at what still needs to be done, and the distance between where you are and where you need to be seems larger than the energy you have available to cross it. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this because he knew that writing was the only way to keep that exhaustion from making decisions for him. He knew that depletion has a voice, and that voice, if not examined, begins to sound like wisdom, begins to build convincing arguments for surrender, for the shortcut, for the easier version of yourself that is always available when the more demanding version has its guard down. And here is where the invisible weight of Marcus Aurelius's leadership needs to be understood not as historical data, but as human experience, because it is exactly there that the meditations stop being an ancient text and become a mirror of the present. When Marcus Aurelius assumed power in 161 AD, Rome was in relative peace, but that peace lasted less than a year. In 162, the Parthian king Vologases IV invaded Armenia and destroyed 2 complete Roman legions, a military humiliation without precedent in decades. The East was in flames. Marcus Aurelius sent Lucius Verus to command the campaign, a decision some historians interpret as political astuteness to keep the co-emperor busy and away from Rome, others as genuine division of responsibilities. It was probably both at the same time, because Marcus Aurelius was rarely just one thing at a time. The Parthian campaign lasted 5 years. Rome won, but the victorious armies brought back, along with the laurels of conquest, something no general had anticipated: a plague. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox according to modern studies, spread through the empire with a speed and mortality Rome had never faced. Conservative estimates speak of 5 million deaths over 2 decades. Broader estimates reach double that. Think about what that means in concrete terms of leadership. You are governing the greatest empire in the world. A war has just been won. And then victory brings a catastrophe of incomprehensible scale. Not an enemy you can face on the battlefield, not a threat that responds to military strategy, but an invisible disease that kills indiscriminately, that ignores borders and hierarchies, that transforms the infrastructure of mobility of your empire, the roads that are your greatest pride, into routes of contagion. How do you govern that? How do you make rational decisions about something with no precedent? How do you maintain the cohesion of an army, a population, an entire administrative structure when fear is spreading faster than any decree can reach? Marcus Aurelius had no manual. There was not enough historical precedent to guide decisions that needed to be made in real time, with incomplete information, in a context where every wrong choice was measured in lives. Many, immense quantities of lives. And it was exactly during that period that the meditations became denser, more repetitive, as if he needed to write the same principles several times for them to remain accessible when external chaos threatened to swallow internal clarity. Return to what depends on you. Return to the present moment, not to what may happen tomorrow, not to what happened yesterday, to what is before you now. to the specific decision that needs to be made with the information you have, with the resources that exist, within the real possibilities of this moment. This is what the Stoics called amor fati, not passive resignation before what is inevitable, but something far more active and far more difficult. The radical acceptance of what is real, combined with the most precise action possible within that reality. Not fighting against what cannot be changed, directing all energy toward what can. The plague was not the only front. While the East still bled and the disease still spread through the interior of the empire, the Germanic tribes in the north, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, others, began pressing the Danube borders with an intensity Rome had not seen in generations. In 166, they crossed the river. In 167, they reached northern Italy for the first time in nearly 300 years. Rome panicked. Marcus Aurelius did not. Not because he was insensitive to the danger. The Meditations make absolutely clear that he felt the weight of every threat with an acuity that most leaders try to anesthetize. But because he had trained deliberately, repeatedly with discipline, not to let the size of the problem determine the quality of his response, not to confuse urgency with despair, to distinguish what demanded immediate action from what required only calm resistance until conditions changed. He went personally to the front. He didn't send generals while governing from Rome. He went. For almost a decade, Marcus Aurelius spent more time in military camps on the margins of the Danube than in the imperial palace. He slept in tents. He ate the same food as the soldiers. He made strategic decisions by day and wrote to himself at night, alone, in a cold tent, about the need to remain human in the middle of all that. Inhumanity. And it was in that tent, on those nights, that the deepest parts of the Meditations were written. Not in a tranquil philosophical garden, not in the safety of an imperial library, but in the middle of war, with the sound of the camps outside, with the weight of the day's decisions still in his body, with the awareness that tomorrow there would be more deaths, more impossible choices, more moments where no option was good, and one had to choose the least bad. Think about what kind of internal discipline is required to do that. To choose, in that context, to examine yourself rather than anesthetize, to write about gentleness and patience and ego control on a night when you spent the entire day making life or death decisions about tens of thousands of people. It is not heroism in the dramatic sense. It is something more silent and more demanding than that. It is the daily refusal to let external circumstances, no matter how extreme, determine the quality of your internal life. It is the insistence that there exists a space between what happens and how you respond, and that space, however small it may seem, is where your real freedom lives. Marcus Aurelius wrote to preserve that space, to not let war, plague, power, exhaustion and loss reduce him to merely what the circumstances made of him. To keep alive, day after day, the version of himself he had decided to be. Not the version the role demanded, not the version others needed him to be, but the version that he, in silence, in a cold tent on the edge of the world, was still trying to reach. But there was something that not even philosophy, not even discipline, not even decades of self-knowledge could prepare Marcus Aurelius to face without scars. Something the Meditations touch with a delicacy that contrasts brutally with the hardness of everything else he wrote. The loss of his children. Marcus Aurelius and Faustina had 13 children. 9 died before reaching adulthood. Let that number land for a moment. Not as a historical statistic, infant mortality rates in the ancient world were devastating, and that is widely documented, but as a human experience, as the specific weight of burying a child, and then another, and then another. at intervals that didn't give enough time for the grief of one to end before the next began. Marcus Aurelius wrote about death with a frequency and depth that no other aspect of the Meditations equals. And for a long time, readers and scholars interpreted this primarily as a Stoic philosophical exercise, the deliberate practice of contemplating mortality so as not to be surprised by it. The memento mori as a tool of existential clarity. That is true, but it is incomplete, because when you read the Meditations knowing he lost 9 children, when you place that context beneath every line where he writes about the inevitability of death, about the brevity of everything that exists, about the need not to cling to what is temporary, the text changes in nature. It is no longer just philosophy. It is a man trying with all the intellectual tools he possesses to survive a pain that no intellectual tool was designed to contain completely. Stoic philosophy said that grief belongs to the category of things that don't depend on you, that the death of those you love is outside your control, and that therefore wisdom lies in accepting, not resisting, in not letting the loss of the external destroy the stability of the internal. Marcus Aurelius believed this, genuinely. You can see in the Meditations the structure of this thinking working, being applied, being used as an anchor in moments of storm. But you can also see, between the lines, the cost of applying that structure against a pain that is larger than any structure can contain completely. You can see a man who is using philosophy not to deny suffering, but to not be destroyed by it, to remain functional, to remain present, to continue being the father who was still alive, the emperor who still needed to govern, the man who had promised himself to stay whole even when the circumstances did everything to shatter him. That distinction is fundamental. And it is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Stoicism, especially in the popular and simplified version that has reached our times. Stoicism does not teach insensitivity. It does not preach the elimination of emotions as an ideal of wisdom. Epictetus, the slave philosopher who was one of the central influences in Marcus Aurelius's formation, said explicitly that the wise man cries, that the wise man feels, that the wise man is human in the full extent of what that means. What Stoicism teaches is the difference between feeling and being governed by what you feel, between emotion as experience and emotion as dictator of behavior. Marcus Aurelius felt. The Meditations make this absolutely clear to anyone who reads with attention. What he trained, what he wrote for himself repeatedly not to forget, was the capacity to feel without losing his axis, to be moved without being swept away, to let pain exist without letting pain take the reins. And that applied to 9 children's deaths, to decades of war, to a plague killing millions, to political and personal betrayals we will continue examining. That is not coldness. It is one of the most demanding and most courageous forms of emotional presence that exists. Because it is much easier to anesthetize than to feel without being destroyed. It is much easier to harden completely than to maintain the permeability necessary to continue being human while also needing to continue being functional. Most people, faced with the repeated and accumulated pain Marcus Aurelius faced, choose one of 2 things. Either they stop feeling, build armor that protects but also isolates, or they are completely engulfed by what they feel and lose the capacity to function. Marcus Aurelius sought the third path, the narrowest, the one that demands the most, the one with no definitive arrival, only a constant practice of balance that needs to be remade every day, because every day something tries to throw it off. Think about the losses you have carried, not necessarily death, though perhaps that too, but losses in the broader sense, the relationship that ended and that took too long for you to understand had truly ended. The version of a person you loved who turned out to be different from what you believed. The project that consumed years, and that didn't reach where it should have. The trust placed in someone who didn't deserve it, and that you don't know how to rebuild. How did you carry that? Did you harden? Did you collapse? Did you stay somewhere in the middle, trying to find a balance no one taught you how to sustain? Marcus Aurelius wrote about exactly that middle space, not because he had arrived there easily, but because he had decided that was where he wanted to live, and that maintaining that decision required daily work, daily recording, daily reaffirmation of principles that exhaustion and pain continuously conspired to make him forget. There was also Faustina. Marcus Aurelius's wife is one of the most controversial and most misunderstood figures in Roman history. The historians of the time, predominantly men, predominantly with political agendas, described her with a suspicious consistency as unfaithful, manipulative, morally questionable. The same historians who had every interest in diminishing the emperor's figure through the figure of the wife. Marcus Aurelius never wrote anything that confirmed those accusations. In the Meditations, he thanks Faustina for being so obedient, so affectionate, and so simple, words that, depending on the translation and context, can be read in very different ways, but that in no reasonable reading suggest a man who distrusted or despised his wife. When Faustina died in 175 AD, during a military campaign in the east, far from Rome, in a mountainous region of Anatolia, Marcus Aurelius had her deified. He asked the Senate to grant her divine honors. He founded an institution in her memory to help orphaned girls from poor families. He carried the mourning with a seriousness that was not imperial protocol, it was personal. She had been his companion for 30 years. She had accompanied military campaigns when most imperial wives stayed in Rome. She had given birth to 13 children and buried 9 of them beside him. She had been, in the language of the Meditations, that document of self-examination written for no one, the only constant witness to who Marcus Aurelius was when he was not being the emperor. Her death was one more layer of weight on a man who was already carrying more than any human structure should be able to bear. And what the Meditations show, what that intimate diary reveals about how Marcus Aurelius processed the accumulation of losses, is that he didn't try to resolve them, didn't seek a conclusion, a closure, a narrative that made the pain make sense in a way that would make it bearable once and for all. Instead, he returned, repeatedly, to the present moment, to the task ahead, to the simplest and most difficult question that Stoicism proposes: what is within my control right now? Not yesterday, not tomorrow, right now. Not what was lost, not what may be lost. What exists, what can be done, what depends on me in this specific moment. This practice, this deliberate and repeated return to the present as anchor against the weight of the past and the anxiety of the future, is probably the most practical and most universally applicable contribution the Meditations offer, not because it is easy, but because it is possible, because it requires no special conditions, doesn't require the pain to disappear, doesn't require circumstances to be otherwise. It requires only the choice made repeatedly to redirect attention, to not let the mind live permanently in what was or what may be, but to bring it back with gentleness and firmness at the same time to what is. Marcus Aurelius did this in a war tent after burying children and leading battles. You can do this in your life, with everything it contains that is difficult, incomplete, unresolved, not because the situation is comparable, but because the tool is the same, and because the man who developed it was not a distant and perfect sage living on a different plane of existence from yours. He was an exhausted, grieving, and overburdened human being who chose every night not to let the weight of what he carried destroy the clarity of what he could still control. But there is an aspect of Marcus Aurelius's life that the Meditations touch with an evasiveness that is no accident, an area where self-knowledge finds its most painful limits, where the most rigorous philosophy finds the blind spot that no internal discipline can completely eliminate. The blind spot that had the name of his only surviving son, Commodus. If you've ever tried to apply rationality to a pain that was larger than any rationality could contain, if you've ever used thought as a shield against something thought was not made to block, write in the comments, "I tried that too." Because that attempt, imperfect, courageous, and profoundly human, is exactly what the most honest pages of the Meditations describe. Commodus was born in 161 AD, the same year Marcus Aurelius became emperor. Of the 13 children Marcus Aurelius and Faustina had, Commodus was the only surviving son who reached adulthood, the only one still alive when the father reached the end of his life, the only one who could, and who would eventually, inherit the greatest empire in the Western world. And here is the detail that history rarely examines with the depth it deserves. Marcus Aurelius knew, not everything, no one knows everything about what a child will become. But he knew enough. He saw enough. The Meditations don't mention Commodus by name, an absence that is itself eloquent, but historians of the time documented with consistency that Marcus Aurelius was aware of his son's character limitations, of the impulsiveness, of the casual cruelty that emerged in small moments before becoming state policy, of the inability to sustain the internal discipline that the father had spent decades cultivating, and that the son never demonstrated any real interest in developing. And yet Marcus Aurelius named him his successor. That decision, perhaps the most consequential and most questioned of his entire life, is the point where the philosopher emperor and the human father collide in a way that no philosophy can completely resolve. Because the reasons for naming Commodus were multiple, complex, and partially understandable, and the reasons why it was a catastrophe are equally multiple, equally complex, and absolutely undeniable. The Roman tradition of dynastic succession had a weight that went beyond personal choice. The stability of the empire depended on a clear and unquestionable transfer of power, and a biological son offered that clarity in a way that no adopted general could match without the risk of civil wars. The 4 emperors before Marcus Aurelius, including Marcus himself, had been adopted, chosen by merit, and that sequence had produced the most stable and most admired period in Roman imperial history. But it had also produced a fragility. The absence of a blood heir always left open the possibility of contestation. Marcus Aurelius had a son of blood, and he chose blood. But there was something more, something the Meditations don't say directly, but that human psychology allows us to infer with reasonable confidence. Hope, the specific hope of a father who had spent his entire life proving that character can be formed, that philosophy can transform, that a human being can consciously choose who they want to be and work every day to become it. The hope that what he had learned through decades of effort could be transmitted, that the formation he had given his son, the tutors, the philosophers, the exposure to the Meditations, to life on campaign, to the progressive responsibilities of power, could do for the son what it had done for him. That hope was wrong, but it was human. It was the hope of every father who believes that the best they have can be passed on, and who discovers with a pain that has no equivalent that transmission is no guarantee. That you can give someone all the tools, and that person may simply choose not to use them, or worse, may use them in ways you never imagined possible. Commodus was named co-emperor at 16 years old. He accompanied Marcus Aurelius on the Danube military campaigns. He was exposed to real leadership, real decisions, the real weight of power. And what historical sources document, with a consistency that goes beyond political bias, is that he did not learn what he should have learned. Not because he was incapable of intelligence, but because he didn't want to, because what power offered Commodus was not responsibility. It was license, not the opportunity to serve. It was the guarantee that no one could say no. Marcus Aurelius died in March of 180 AD. The sources diverge on the exact cause of death. Probably the plague that had devastated the empire for almost 2 decades, finally reaching the man who had governed in its midst. He died at the frontier, in the field, in the city of Vindobona, what is today Vienna, not in Rome, not in the palace, in the place where he had spent most of the last years of his life, among the soldiers, at the edge of the world he had defended. He was 58 years old, and in his final days, in the last moments documented by historians who were present, what he did was completely coherent with who he had been his entire life. He refused food to hasten death and not prolong suffering unnecessarily. He said farewell to his closest friends with the serenity of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly that moment, not with fear, not with resistance, but with the clarity of one who had examined death so repeatedly on paper that he had removed much of the terror it carries for most people. And he left the empire to Commodus. What happened next is one of the most disturbing and most revealing stories about what power does to a human being who has not developed the internal structure necessary to carry it. Commodus was 19 years old when he became the most powerful man in the Western world. And in the first months, in the first signs of what was to come, there was still the possibility that the father's fears were exaggerated, that the real responsibility of power could produce the maturation that formation had not managed to achieve. That possibility lasted briefly. In 182, just 2 years after Marcus Aurelius's death, Commodus's sister, Lucilla, led a conspiracy to assassinate him. The conspiracy failed, and Commodus's response to the failure of the conspiracy revealed definitively and irreversibly what lay beneath the surface that his father had tried to form. He didn't just execute the conspirators, which would have been understandable and within the parameters of what any emperor would do in the face of an assassination attempt. He transformed the failed attempt into a permanent license for paranoia. He executed senators on the basis of vague or fabricated accusations. He exiled or killed anyone he perceived as a potential threat, not a real, documented threat, but a potential one. Someone who was too intelligent, someone who had too much popularity, someone who had, at some point, said something Commodus interpreted as disrespect. The Roman Senate, the institution Marcus Aurelius had treated with consistent respect, consulting it even when not obligated to, maintaining with it a partnership relationship that senators recognized and valued, became under Commodus a field of terror. Senators attended sessions without knowing whether they would return home. They built defensive alliances based not on politics, but on survival. They learned to smile at a man they could despise and to applaud decisions they considered madness, because the alternative was death. But political paranoia was only one layer of what Commodus became. The most visible layer for history, the most documented by the senators and historians who survived to write about him. There were other layers, more personal, more revealing about the specific psychology of a man who grew up in the shadow of a father impossible to surpass. Commodus did not want to be emperor in the sense his father had been emperor. He didn't want the responsibility, the deliberation, the weight of decisions affecting millions. He wanted power without the cost. He wanted divinity without the humanity. He wanted to be admired, worshipped, literally, without needing to do the work that transforms a man into something worthy of admiration. And then he began to construct, piece by piece, an alternative reality in which that would be possible. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He appeared in public wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club, the attributes of the demigod, and demanded people treat him as a living divinity. He renamed Rome with his own name, Colonia Commodiana. He renamed the months of the year with variations of his own name. He renamed the army, the Senate, the Roman people. Everything came to carry in some way the mark of his name. It was not just megalomania in the political sense. It was something deeper and more unsettling. It was a man trying to replace reality with a version of it in which he was central, supreme, and unquestionable. It was the response of a psychology that had never developed the internal structure needed to exist in a world that didn't revolve entirely around it. Marcus Aurelius spent nights writing about the need to reduce the ego, to serve, to remember that power is temporary and that what endures is only character. The son spent nights in the Colosseum, fighting as a gladiator, the emperor of Rome descending into the arena to fight against opponents who obviously couldn't hurt him, and being applauded by a crowd that applauded out of fear as much as entertainment. The contrast could not be more absolute. And it is in that contrast, in that abysmal distance between father and son, between the meditations and the arena, between self-examination and self-deification, that the most unsettling question about Marcus Aurelius emerges. How did the man who most deeply understood the importance of character formation produce the man who most completely demonstrated its absence? That question has no simple answer, but it has answers. Answers that say something fundamental about the limits of what one human being can transmit to another. Even with love, even with intention, even with all the tools that philosophy and power combined can offer. If you've ever done everything right, formed, taught, tried to transmit what you knew was true, and watched someone you loved choose the opposite path, write in the comments, "I gave everything I had." Because that experience, which Marcus Aurelius knew in a way few can imagine, is perhaps the most silently devastating that exists. And recognizing it is not weakness, it is the honesty that most people don't have the courage to admit out loud. There is a question historians have been asking about Commodus for 2,000 years, and that none of them have managed to answer in a completely satisfactory way. Why didn't Marcus Aurelius remove him? It is not a simple question, but it is an honest one, because the evidence that Commodus was not prepared for power did not appear only after the father's death. It appeared before. During the Danube military campaigns, when Commodus demonstrated repeatedly that he preferred the comfort of the camp to the real work of leadership, when he negotiated a peace with the Marcomanni in 180, shortly after Marcus Aurelius's death, that the father himself had refused as insufficient, and that Commodus accepted not because it was strategically wise, but because he wanted to return to Rome as quickly as possible. Marcus Aurelius's closest advisors, generals, senators, philosophers who had accompanied decades of leadership, knew what was coming. Some tried, with the delicacy the situation required, to signal their concerns. Marcus Aurelius listened, considered, and continued on the course he had chosen. Why? The most honest answer, the one the meditations allow us to infer without ever saying directly, is that in that decision there was a convergence of factors that none of them in isolation explains completely, but that together form a portrait of something profoundly human. There was tradition, which we have already examined. There was hope, which we have also touched. But there was a third thing, something the meditations reveal about Marcus Aurelius in a way that is simultaneously his greatest virtue and his most consequential blind spot. He believed, in an absolutely genuine way, that every human being has the capacity to choose who they want to be. That character is not destiny, it is a decision. That formation matters, that environment matters, that models matter, but that in the end, every person has within them the capacity to examine, to choose, and to act according to what they chose. That belief was the foundation of all the Stoic philosophy he practiced. It was what made self-knowledge possible, the conviction that there exists a self that can be examined, a character that can be formed, a distance between what you are and what you decide to be that can be crossed with work and discipline. And that belief prevented him from giving up completely on Commodus, because giving up on Commodus would have meant admitting that there was a human being for whom that capacity did not exist, that there was a person who was beyond the reach of what formation, love, and philosophy could do. And that fundamentally contradicts what Marcus Aurelius believed about human nature. So he continued forming, continued trying, continued assigning Commodus to progressively larger responsibilities in the hope that the real weight of leadership would produce what instruction had not managed, and continued writing to himself at night about the need not to judge others, not to give up on anyone, to recognize in every human being, no matter how difficult that person may be, the same rational nature and the same capacity for virtue that you recognize in yourself. This is the most human and most painful tension in the Meditations, the same principle that made Marcus Aurelius extraordinary as a leader. The refusal to dehumanize even those who had acted in ways that merited dehumanization was the principle that prevented him from making a decision that might have changed the course of Roman history. And here is where this story stops being about the past and becomes brutally relevant to the present. You probably have, or have had, someone like that in your life. Not necessarily a son. It could be a brother, a partner, a close friend, a colleague in whom you invested time and energy and trust. Someone in whom you saw real potential. Not imagined, not projected, but genuinely present. Someone who had all the conditions to be different from what they were being, and who chose repeatedly not to be. And you stayed, kept trying, kept believing that the next conversation, the next opportunity, the next demonstration of real consequence would be the turning point. Kept going because giving up seemed like a way of betraying not just the person, but what you believe about the human capacity for change. Marcus Aurelius stayed for exactly that reason, and paid a price that the entire world paid with him. But there is something this situation reveals about the Meditations that goes beyond the era of judgment about Commodus. Something Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly, and that, in this specific context, takes on a dimension that abstract philosophical reading cannot fully capture. He wrote about the difference between what you can control and what you cannot, repeatedly, with an insistence that suggests he needed to remember this with a frequency that went beyond intellectual exercise. Another person's behavior, any person, regardless of how close, how loved, how formed by you, is outside what you can control. It is in the category of external things, of things that happen and that you cannot determine. What you can control is how you respond, what you do with what is before you, the quality of your own choice within the circumstances that exist. Marcus Aurelius wrote that to himself while watching his son choose repeatedly and deliberately the opposite of everything that had been taught. And the tension between that philosophical principle, accepting what cannot be controlled, and the paternal love that could not completely accept that Commodus was beyond the reach of change, is palpable in the Meditations for anyone who reads them with that context in mind. It is not a resolved tension. There is no entry where Marcus Aurelius says, "I have accepted it. I am at peace with this." The philosophy worked completely here. There is instead repetition, the constant return to the same principles, which in itself is the most honest evidence that there was something that resisted resolution, something that continued demanding the work of being re-examined because it had not been completely processed. And that, paradoxically, is one of the most comforting things about the Meditations for anyone who reads them honestly, because it reveals that even the man considered the supreme example of philosophical virtue in Western history had points where philosophy found its limits, where the human resisted the sage, where the father prevailed over the emperor in ways that no internal discipline could completely neutralize. You don't need to be perfect to be admirable. You don't need to have resolved everything to be worthy of respect. Marcus Aurelius had not resolved Commodus. He had learned to live with that non-resolution, continuing to function, continuing to serve, continuing to write, without letting it define him completely. But there is another aspect of Marcus Aurelius's life that the Meditations illuminate in a way that history rarely examines with the depth it deserves. And that goes directly to the heart of what Stoicism really teaches about power, about betrayal, and about the most counterintuitive decision any leader can make. In 175 AD, while Marcus Aurelius was still alive, still governing, still writing, one of his most talented and most trusted generals did something that very few people in Roman imperial history had dared to do. Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor. He was not an obscure general. He was the man who had commanded the victorious Parthian campaign. He was one of Rome's most respected military figures. He was someone Marcus Aurelius had treated with genuine trust, not the performative trust that leaders display publicly to maintain appearances, but the genuine trust built over years of shared work and shared responsibility. And this person had betrayed that trust in a way that admitted no alternative interpretations. He had raised his own standard. He had declared the emperor dead based on a false rumor and had begun consolidating power in the East. Marcus Aurelius's response to this betrayal is one of the most studied and most debated in Roman history, and it is also, within the context of the Meditations, the most coherent with everything he had written about how a human being should respond to those who act unjustly. He did not collapse. He did not let the anger, which certainly existed, which the Meditations allow us to infer with confidence, because he was human and had been betrayed by someone he trusted, make the decisions that needed to be made. He gathered the legions, he prepared a campaign, and he sent a message to Cassius saying he preferred to resolve the situation personally, face to face, rather than have a civil war that would cost Roman lives on both sides. Before that resolution was possible, Cassius was assassinated by his own soldiers who, realizing Marcus Aurelius was alive and marching in their direction, calculated that betraying the traitor was smarter than facing the legitimate emperor. The head of Cassius was sent to Marcus Aurelius. He refused to look at it, ordered it to be buried with honors. And then, in a gesture that shocked the Senate, that shocked the army, that continues to be studied by historians and philosophers 2,000 years later, he declared complete amnesty for all those who had supported the revolt. He prosecuted no one. He executed no one. He did not use the victory as an opportunity to eliminate political adversaries under the pretext of complicity with the betrayal. He said, in essence, "It is over. Let us return to work." The Meditations explain that behavior better than any political analysis could. Because in the private pages he wrote for no one, Marcus Aurelius had worked repeatedly on an idea that most people find impossible to apply in real life, especially after a betrayal. To punish with anger is to transfer control of yourself to the one who hurt you. It is to let another's behavior determine yours. It is to lose exactly what the aggressor intended you to lose. The axis, the clarity, the capacity to act from values rather than react from emotions. To forgive, not in the sentimental and passive sense the word often carries, but in the active and deliberate sense of choosing not to let the injustice suffered corrode the integrity of who you decided to be, is the most powerful act that exists. Not because it is easy, precisely because it isn't. Marcus Aurelius did not forgive Cassius because he felt no anger. He forgave because he had decided that anger would not make the decisions he needed to make, because he had trained in hundreds of pages of private diary to create the necessary distance between what he felt and how he acted. And that distance, that space between stimulus and response that the Stoics considered the territory of real human freedom, is what the Meditations teach in a way that no other philosophical text can equal, because it is not taught as theory. It is demonstrated as practice, lived under conditions that most people will never need to face, but that illuminate, with a clarity that everyday situations rarely produce, what that practice truly means and what it truly costs. There is a phrase in the Meditations that Marcus Aurelius wrote probably more than once, in different variations, in different contexts, on different nights, and that summarizes, with a precision that 2,000 years have not managed to make obsolete, what he had learned about death after an entire life of losses. Waste as little time as possible thinking about others, except to act in their benefit. It is not a phrase about death in the literal sense. It is a phrase about what happens when you live as if time were infinite, as if there were always more. More time to say what needs to be said, more time to do what needs to be done, more time to be who you decided to be, as if postponement were an option available indefinitely. Marcus Aurelius knew it was not abstractly, concretely, cumulatively, inscribed in body and memory by decades of real loss. 9 children. His mentor, Epictetus, whose philosophy had formed his thinking before he even knew he would one day need it to survive what was coming. Marcus Fronto, the rhetoric teacher who had been one of the most important figures in his intellectual formation. Antoninus Pius, the adoptive father who had governed Rome with an almost impossible stability and who had died in Marcus Aurelius's arms after a life of consistent example. Lucius Verus, the indulgent and imperfect co-emperor who had been, despite everything, his partner, and who died suddenly in 169 from causes probably related to the plague during a military campaign. Each of those deaths had added a layer to what Marcus Aurelius wrote about time. Not the abstract time of philosophers, but concrete, irrecoverable time that passes while you are busy with other things, and that doesn't come back regardless of how much power you have to command everything else. The memento mori, remember that you will die, is often presented as a somber principle, as if it were an invitation to melancholy, a meditation on the weight of finitude that serves to depress more than to illuminate. Marcus Aurelius lived it in a completely different way. For him, awareness of death was not an additional weight on a man who already carried more than any human structure should be able to bear. It was the opposite. It was the instrument that made the weight bearable. Because when you know, truly not as a concept, but as a felt reality, that time is finite, that every day that passes doesn't come back, that the version of you that exists today will not exist forever, something fundamental changes in how you relate to what matters and what doesn't. What doesn't matter becomes smaller. It doesn't disappear. The irritations continue to exist, the injustices continue to exist, the difficult people continue to exist. But the amount of energy you're willing to spend on them changes. The perspective changes, the proportion changes, and what matters becomes more urgent. Not with the anxious urgency of one who is afraid of losing, but with the serene clarity of one who knows exactly where the real value is and doesn't want to let the moment pass to act accordingly. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this repeatedly because repeatedly he forgot, Because human nature has an extraordinary capacity to act as if time were infinite, even when the evidence to the contrary is abundant and painful. Because exhaustion, routine, the urgency of immediate problems continuously conspires to make what is truly important seem less urgent than what is merely noisy. Think about the conversations you postponed, not the difficult ones in the sense of conflict, though those also exist, but the others. The ones you postponed because the moment didn't seem right, because life was rushed, because there was always something more immediate demanding attention. The conversation with someone you love about what really matters to both of you. The expression of gratitude for something that changed your life and that the person may not know changed it. The request for forgiveness that you know you need to make, but that keeps waiting for a clarity that never arrives, because clarity doesn't precede action, it results from it. Marcus Aurelius had the greatest power in the world and could not recover the time that had passed, could not bring back the children he had buried, could not revisit the conversations he hadn't had with the father he barely knew, could not undo the years of absence that wars had created between him and the people he loved. Absolute power over millions couldn't buy back a single second. And the Meditations are, in part, the record of a man who understood this early, enough to change how he lived, but not early enough to have nothing to regret, because no one understands this early enough to have nothing to regret. The question is not to arrive at zero regrets. The question is how you use what you understand now to live differently from here. He wrote about emperors who had governed before him, Augustus, Vespasian, Trajan, Hadrian, and who were now just names, who had been as real, as present, as central to the world they governed as he was to his, and the world had continued completely without them. That their absence had produced a gap that lasted exactly the time necessary for life to fill that space with something else. Not with sadness, with clarity, with the question that clarity necessarily raises. If all of this is temporary, if power is temporary, if fame is temporary, if the very name that history will preserve is temporary in the real scope of time, then what is not temporary? What remains when everything else passes? The answer, the Meditations propose, not as a philosophical conclusion, but as a daily practice verified in the real experience of a life lived under extreme conditions, is this: character, the way you treated people, the choices you made when you had options, the consistency between what you said you believed and what you demonstrated believing with your daily actions. Not what you built. Who you were while building. Not what people said about you. What you said to yourself at night, alone, without an audience, when no one was watching and the only witness was yourself. This is what the Meditations preserve. Not the battles Marcus Aurelius won. History books preserve that better. Not the territories he governed. Maps preserve that. But the internal dialogue of a man who chose, day after day and night after night, to examine himself rather than anesthetize himself. Who chose uncomfortable clarity over the comfort of illusion. Who chose to be an honest witness to himself even when, especially when, that honesty revealed things that were difficult to see. He was afraid, not of death itself. The Meditations are clear about this. Death was for him a natural event that reason could accept without terror. But of the specific kind of death he considered the only one truly to be avoided, death while still alive. The death of character while the body still functions. The gradual erosion of who you decided to be under the continuous pressure of circumstances that push in the opposite direction. That is the death the Meditations exist to prevent, not biological death. That Marcus Aurelius accepted with a serenity that disturbed those around him, but the death of integrity, the death of consistency between the internal and the external. the death of the space between stimulus and response where real freedom lives. You can die that way at 30, with decades of biological life still ahead of you. You can die that way in small moments, every time you act contrary to what you believe, every time you let exhaustion or fear or ego make a decision that your more examined version would never make. Every time the social character you present to the world and the real human being that exists beneath it drift further apart without you doing anything to bring them closer. Marcus Aurelius wrote to prevent that death, to keep alive night after night the thread connecting who he was to who he had decided to be, to not let the emperor completely swallow the man, to not let power, loss, exhaustion, and time transform the author of the Meditations into a figure that the author of the Meditations would not recognize. And in his final years, in the last pages he wrote, in the last decisions he made, in how he conducted the last months before dying in a tent on the frontier of the world he had dedicated his life to protecting. The evidence suggests that he had managed it, not perfectly, never perfectly, but with a consistency that those around him recognized, and that history preserved with a respect that 2,000 years have not managed to diminish. He died being the man he had decided to be, not the emperor that official Rome celebrated, not the philosopher that posterity would canonize, but the specific, concrete man full of contradictions and work still to do, who had chosen every night, even the heaviest, even the most exhausting, even those with nothing grand about them, to sit alone with a papyrus roll and be honest with himself. That choice, simple in form, immeasurable in demand, is the real legacy of the Meditations, not the philosophical concepts, though they are valuable, not the wisdom about power and leadership, though it is undeniable, but the lived example that self-knowledge is not a destination you reach. It is a practice you sustain, that it has no arrival, that it needs to be remade every day because every day something tries to undo it. If the answer to this question bothers you, if you know, without needing to think much, that there is a distance between who you are and who you decided to be that you are not addressing, write in the comments, "Not yet, but I will be." At some point between 177 and 180 AD, in the last years of Marcus Aurelius's life, when his body was already yielding to the illness that would eventually kill him, and the empire still demanded everything he had, Commodus, then 16 or 17 years old, was elevated to the title of co-emperor, not as a surprise. As the deliberate decision of a father who knew what he was doing and who chose to do it anyway. Marcus Aurelius had spent his last years trying to prepare his son for what was coming. He had taken Commodus on the military campaigns. He had tried to transmit, through proximity and gradual responsibility, what decades of philosophy and intimate diary had built in himself. And he had failed. Not completely, not yet, but enough for any honest observer to see that Commodus had not absorbed what he needed to absorb, that the son who accompanied the father on campaigns was different from what any father would want his son to be, that there was something in Commodus's psychological structure that resisted formation, not because he was incapable of intelligence, but because he had found in the absence of internal structure a form of power that was more immediate, more satisfying and easier than the slow and invisible work of self-knowledge. Marcus Aurelius knew that, and named Commodus anyway. But here is what that decision reveals, when read through the Meditations, through what Marcus Aurelius had written repeatedly about the limits of human control, that goes beyond error of judgment or paternal weakness. He had arrived, at some point in his last years of life, at an understanding that the Meditations suggest, without ever articulating directly, that there are things you cannot save, people you cannot change, outcomes you cannot control, regardless of how much love, how much effort, how much power you employ in the attempt. And that wisdom lies not in denying that reality. It lies in acting correctly within it. Even so, he had done what he could do. He had tried what he could try. He had transmitted what he could transmit. The rest was outside his control, was in the territory the Stoics called indifferent, the external things, the things that happen and that you cannot determine, only accept and respond to with the best version of yourself you can sustain. That acceptance was not resignation. It was something more precise and more difficult than that. It was the refusal to let the outcome, which he probably already knew would be catastrophic, destroy the quality of his own choices in the time he still had. It was the insistence that the value of his actions did not depend on producing the desired result to be real. It was the separation, painful, necessary, fundamentally stoic, between what you do and what happens because of what you do. You can do the right thing, and the result can be wrong. You can love completely, and the person you love may not become what you hoped. You can dedicate decades to something, and what you built may be destroyed by forces that were beyond your reach. And still, the right thing continued being right. The love continued being real. The dedication continued having value, not because it produced the result it should have, but because it was consistent with the kind of person you had decided to be. And because that consistency is the only thing no one can take from you, regardless of what happens to what you built. Marcus Aurelius died knowing that Commodus would destroy what had taken decades to build. Not with documented certainty. History doesn't give us access to that degree of private awareness, but with a probability that any honest man in his position, looking at the son he had named his successor, could calculate without needing prophecy. And he went anyway, continued governing, continued writing, continued being the man he had decided to be until the last day he had. We want our efforts to produce results. We want the love we give to be reciprocated. We want the dedication we invest in a person, a project, an idea to be enough to guarantee the outcome we expect. We want, in essence, control over results, and we build much of our identity around a narrative of direct causality. I do this, therefore that happens. Marcus Aurelius had learned in the most expensive way that exists through direct and repeated experience, that narrative is a comfortable illusion, that the world doesn't work that way, that you can do everything right with all the competence, dedication, and love you possess, and the result may still not come. Something else may happen. Commodus may happen. And the question the meditations propose, silently, through an entire life documented in their pages, is not how to avoid that outcome. It is what you do with it when it arrives. Do you let the result define the value of what you did? Do you decide, retrospectively, that the effort wasn't worth it because it didn't produce what it should have? Do you harden, close, stop investing so as not to have to face again the pain of having invested completely and the result having been wrong anyway? Or do you find a way to separate the two things, what you gave and what happened, and recognize that the value of what you gave doesn't depend on what happened to be real? That separation is the heart of Stoicism, and it is also, ironically, what makes Stoicism so misunderstood, because it seems from the outside a philosophy of indifference, of emotional distance, of detachment that borders on coldness. But Marcus Aurelius was not cold. The Meditations are the warmest and most human document that exists about the real cost of living with integrity. Every page reveals a man who felt deeply, who loved, who suffered, who got irritated, who tired, who wanted things to be different from what they were. There was no indifference. There was something far more demanding than indifference. There was the refusal to let what he felt determine what he did. Marcus Aurelius chose. Even when he felt anger, he chose not to act from it. Even when he felt exhaustion, he chose to continue. Even when he felt the silent despair of watching his son deliberately walk toward what would destroy everything, he chose to continue loving, continued trying, continued being a father with everything he had to be a father, because that was what he had decided to be, and because Commodus's behavior did not have the power to undo that decision unless he himself gave it that power. You stop asking, "What will I build that will last?" And you start asking, "Who will I be while I build?" And that change of question, small in form, radical in its implications, changes everything. If you have ever given everything you had, in a relationship, in a project, in a person, and the result did not correspond to what the investment deserved, write in the comments, "I gave everything and the result was different," not as lament, as recognition that you know, in the most real way that exists, the terrain on which the meditations were written. In March of 180 AD, in a city called Vindobona, what is today Vienna, Austria, Marcus Aurelius called his closest friends near. Not the senators, not the generals, not the representatives of official power who had spent decades orbiting around him, with the calculated loyalty of those who know that proximity to power is, in itself, a form of power. The friends, the people who knew him, not the emperor, not the philosopher that posterity would canonize, but the specific man who existed beneath all of that. The man who wrote alone at night about the difficulty of getting out of bed. The man who had buried 9 children and a co-emperor and a wife, and decades of hope about the only son who had survived. The man who had carried the greatest weight the Western world had placed on a human being, and who had chosen every night not to let that weight destroy who he had decided to be. That man called his friends. And what happened in those final hours, documented by historians, present with a restraint suggesting they were in the presence of something words could not fully capture, was completely coherent with everything Marcus Aurelius had written in the preceding decades. He was serene, not the performative serenity of the leader who needs to die with dignity for history, not the resignation of a man who had given up wanting to live, but the specific serenity of someone who had examined his own death with such frequency, such honesty, such willingness to look directly at what most people spend their entire lives avoiding looking at, that he had removed much of the terror it carries. Not all the terror. No one removes all the terror, but enough that death arrived not as a devastating surprise, but as the logical conclusion of a life that had been, from the beginning, examined with awareness of its own finitude. He had lived as someone who knew he was going to die, and he died as someone who had lived that way. He was 58 years old. Commodus was present, or close enough to be called, and what Marcus Aurelius said to him in those final hours, if he said anything significant, if there was a last attempt to transmit what 2 decades of deliberate formation had not managed to transmit, was not recorded, or was recorded and did not survive, or was recorded by someone who considered that what passed between father and son in that moment was too private to be preserved for posterity. What we know is that Commodus left that room being the same Commodus who had entered it. That the final moments of Marcus Aurelius, whatever their content, did not produce the transformation the father had hoped for, worked for, and probably continued hoping for until the end, that not even all the philosophy in the world could extinguish completely. The son departed, the father died, and Rome woke the next day being governed by a man different in everything that mattered from the man who had governed before. But here is what Marcus Aurelius's death reveals, when seen not as a historical event, but as the final moment of an examined life, that goes beyond any analysis of what he built or what Commodus destroyed. He had reached the end being recognizable to himself, not perfect, not without regrets, not without contradictions, but recognizable, consistent in something fundamental that had crossed decades of pressure, loss, betrayal, and exhaustion without being completely destroyed. The thread was still there. The thread between who he had decided to be and who he demonstrated being with his daily choices. Imperfect, irregular, sometimes thinner than it should have been, but present, not broken. Still connecting the man of the Meditations to the man who had governed Rome, to the man who was dying in a tent on the frontier of the world. That thread, that consistency that no circumstance had managed to completely sever, is the real legacy of Marcus Aurelius. Not the territory he governed, not the battles he won, not the relative peace he had maintained for almost 2 decades in one of the most turbulent periods of imperial history, but the fact that a human being, placed under the most extreme conditions that power and loss and responsibility and time can create, chose every night to sit alone and be honest with himself. And that choice, made repeatedly over decades, produced something that history rarely produces: a man who reached the end of his life being the person he had decided to be. Now, why does this matter to you? On any given day, with your own problems that have nothing of the scale of Marcus Aurelius's problems, but that are completely real for the life you are living. Why does the death of a 2nd century Roman emperor have anything to say? Because the question the Meditations leave, the one Marcus Aurelius asked himself every night, and that the diary preserved for anyone honest enough to receive it, is not about Rome. It is not about Stoic philosophy. It is not about power or leadership or anything that belongs exclusively to the historical context in which it was written. The question is this: at the end, when the time you have runs out, when the people you loved are no longer here, and the projects you built have been inherited by whoever will do with them what they will do, will you be recognizable to yourself? Not admirable to posterity, not celebrated by history, not preserved in books or statues or any other form of external record, recognizable to you, to the specific human being that exists beneath everything you present to the world, who knows, with the precision that only internal honesty produces, the distance between who you are and who you decided to be. That question has no easy answer. It has no definitive answer while you are still alive, because while you are alive, the answer is still being built, still being decided. By what you will do today, by the choice you will make tomorrow, by the small, invisible moment this week when no one is watching and you will decide who you are without an audience. Marcus Aurelius answered that question every night, imperfectly, repetitively, with the brutal honesty of someone who knows the answer is never complete, but who also knows that not answering is the only guaranteed way to arrive at the end without it. And what the Meditations preserve, what that diary that was never written for you contains for anyone who reads it with enough honesty, is not wisdom in the academic sense. It is company. It is the evidence that the work of being human with integrity is difficult for everyone. That the same internal battles you fight were fought by the most powerful man in the world, at night, alone, without guarantee of victory, and without stopping trying. You are not alone in the distance between who you are and who you decided to be. Marcus Aurelius was there. He wrote about being there. He continued trying to cross that distance, knowing it never disappears completely. That the work of crossing it is not something you finish, it is something you do every day, or you don't. And the only difference between the people who arrive at the end, recognizable to themselves, and those who arrive strangers to themselves, is that daily and invisible choice to continue doing the work, to continue examining, to continue being honest with yourself, even when honesty is the most inconvenient thing available. Marcus Aurelius did that. Not perfectly, but persistently, until the end. The question that remains, the last one this video leaves, the same that the meditations leave for anyone who closes them and looks at their own life, is simple, direct, the kind that seems easy to answer until you really try. Today, with everything you are carrying, with everything you haven't yet resolved, with everything you are still trying to be, were you the person you decided to be? You don't need to answer here. You don't need to answer out loud. You just need to carry that question with you, with the honesty it deserves, with the willingness to let it do the work that only true questions can do. The work of revealing, of clarifying, of showing, without mercy and without haste, who you truly are and who you can still be if you choose to keep trying. Marcus Aurelius spent 58 years making that choice and left, in the pages of a diary he never planned for anyone to read, the most honest evidence that exists that that choice is worth the cost it charges. And now, before this video ends, I need to tell you what happened next. Because the story of Marcus Aurelius does not end with his serene death in a tent on the frontier of the world. It ends with what Commodus did with what the father had built, with what happens when absolute power arrives in the hands of a man who never developed the internal structure to carry it, with a sequence of events that begins with delirious grandeur and ends in a bathtub on a December night, with an assassin sent by the people closest to the emperor, a murder planned inside the palace itself by people who should have been loyal, on a night that Rome had been waiting for in silence, with a relief no one dared express out loud for years. In the next video, we will enter that story, not as historical curiosity, but as what it really is, the most brutal portrait that exists of what power does to a human being who never learned to govern himself before trying to govern everything else. Commodus, the son who destroyed everything, and the people who decided the world would be better without him. If you made it this far, if you stayed from beginning to end, if you carried the questions along, if at some point in this video you felt that specific sensation of hearing something you already knew but had never been able to name, that already says everything about who you are. Most people don't stay. Most people pass. Most people consume without letting the content consume something in them. You stayed. You listened. You let the questions do the work that true questions do. That is not small, and it is not an accident. So before you leave, before you close this video and return to everything else life demands, I need to ask you 3 things, not out of protocol, because each one of them matters in a real way. The first, hit the like button now, not for the number, for what the gesture represents. Every like tells the algorithm that this kind of content deserves to be seen. That real philosophy, applied to real lives, with the honesty Marcus Aurelius practiced in the pages he never planned for anyone to read, that kind of content has value. And every additional person this video reaches is one more person who can leave here with a question. That changes something. Hit the like now before you forget. The second, go to the comments and write, "I am still building." 3 words. But they say everything. That you understood what Marcus Aurelius practiced every night, that you recognize the distance between who you are and who you decided to be, and that you are choosing to keep trying to cross it rather than pretending it doesn't exist or giving up on crossing it. Write, "I am still building." We read every comment, and many times it is in those comments, in that simple declaration made in public, for yourself as much as for whoever is reading, that something real begins to change. The third, if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now and activate the bell. Not out of habit, not because you subscribe to everything that appears in front of you, but because what is being built here is a series, a line of thought that began with Socrates, passed through Aristotle, reached Marcus Aurelius, and that will Continue with the stories and ideas that most radically changed how human beings understand themselves, each other, and the world they inhabit together. Each video is a piece, and the pieces connect in ways that only appear to those who follow the entire sequence. Subscribe, activate the bell, don't lose the thread. And the next video, the one that comes after this, the one that answers the question left in the air in the last few minutes, is on the screen right now. It is there, waiting. It is the story of the son who destroyed everything the father had built. It is the most brutal portrait that exists of what happens when absolute power meets a human being who never learned to govern himself before trying to govern everything else. Commodus. The heir Rome didn't deserve, and the assassination that no one mourned. Click now. It's on the screen.